heartily thank to my daughter Henrike, who is Professor for Medieval Studies in the Oxford University, who opened just this meeting. I welcome you all, and I'm very glad to see so many friends and colleagues on the screen. And I'm very much looking forward to the lecture of Professor Rambachan. And I would like to introduce him to you and then give the floor to him. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome and introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Anantanand Rambachan. In terms of his commitment to the field of religions, dialogue, and peace work, he can be described as an interfaith citizen of the world. He has worked as professor in Minnesota, but has taught in various countries, not least at the Academy of World Religions in Hamburg, in Germany. It is important to him to bring the humane traditions of Hinduism to life for our time and to engage in dialogue, exchange, and cooperation with people from different religions. To this end, he is in discussion with both the World Council of Churches and the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue at the Vatican. I would just like to mention as characteristic book titles A Hindu Theology of Liberation and his new book, Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue. In the first common book of our Standing Commission Strengthening Interreligious Education of Religions for Peace, titled Faithful Peace, Why the Journey to Resilience is Multi-Religious, inspired mainly by our former General Secretary, Professor Azar Karam, he published a remarkable article, The Political and the Theological, Hindu Justification for Interreligious Engagement. It is full of strong arguments for interreligious learning, for working together, and profiting from each other. We go beyond the political arguments for a peaceful living together in a pluralistic society. Being aware of God, being aware of the infinite, means for religiously convinced people humbleness and a life of responsibility and openness. I quote, "If our theologies cannot limit the limitless, we can all learn and be enriched by the ways in which others have experienced and apprehended the absolute by the ways derived from such encounters and experiences. This goes against all narrowness, which can be found too often in religions." The topic on which Professor Rambachan is speaking to us today is more than urgent. The paradox of religion as peacemaker and contributor to violence. We see hardliners in many countries spreading hatred and devaluating other groups of people, exercise violence and oppression. Right-wing political slogans are booming. What is worse is that hatred is also being nurtured and fueled by various religious leaders. Where is the power of religions to bring peace? Despite everything, it is alive in many places on earth, often in secret, but also through the visible appearance of coalitions of people of goodwill within and outside religious communities. The experiences and stories of successful conflict resolution must be kept alive. What can be done that interreligious learning and peace education remain an indispensable contribution to ensuring that the vision of sword to plowshares remain the guiding principle? Professor Rambachan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Lähnemann, for your very kind words of introduction. Let me begin, first of all, by thanking the Oxford Interfaith forum and our host, Thea, for bringing us together for this discussion today. I am, of course, very deeply honored that I was invited to give the Professor Lähnemann interfaith lecture on peacemaking, a distinguished series to which he invited me. I will be sharing a few text slides for my presentation so that you can more easily follow the trend of my talk. Please don't spend too much time reading if you do not want to. You can also choose to listen. So you would see some slides that I will use as I go through the points of my presentation with you today. The title that I chose for my lecture today aims to avoid two familiar positions in conversations about religion and violence. The first, simply stated, is that religion has nothing to do with violence. This is a very idealistic understanding of religion that aims to exempt religion from all responsibility for violence. Religion, so the argument goes, is only about peace and peacemaking. And when religion is invoked to legitimize violence and to motivate practitioners to engage in violent acts, religion is being exploited or religion is being misused. Blame for violence in the name of religion is often, in this view, attributed to the extremists in the various religious traditions. The second position, advocated mainly by those who reject religion, is that religion intrinsically disposes human beings to violence. I know many of you will be familiar with the writings of Christopher Hitchens, who contends that organized religion is violent, intolerant, irrational, and divisive. It is an ally of racism and tribalism and discourages free inquiry. Similar arguments were advanced by others. Richard Dawkins, for example. In this view, religion contributes to the formation of identities, and these identities are oppositional and often hierarchical, disposing us to conflict and violence. So these are the two positions. The truth about religion and conflict and violence may be found, I want to suggest, in the space between these two extremes. It is difficult to argue historically that religion is always innocent and exempt from responsibility in situations of violent conflict. I think it's a hard argument to make. Religion, admittedly, is not the sole explanation for any of these conflicts, and the religious factor is often intermeshed with historical, political, economic, ethnic, and cultural dimensions. But yet, we cannot overlook the role of religion in intensifying narrow loyalties, negatively defining others, deepening divisions, and providing a motivation for violence. When we turn our attention to understanding the role of religion in situations of conflict, we need to be critically aware of the ways in which religious traditions are located in historical and socio-political contexts. they become intertwined and associated with forces and movements that promote division by privileging one group and marginalizing others, and by lending support to sides, different sides, in contests for power. The rise of religious nationalism in many parts of our world is only one example of an alliance between religion and political forces that contribute to conflict. The responsibility of religion in situations of division and conflict is therefore, I'm arguing, entangled with historical, racial, ethnic, economic, and political factors that cannot be overlooked for the sake of what I would call a superficial peace. Interreligious efforts at peacemaking must go deep to understand the underlying causes of our mistrust and divisions. We must not rush to label conflicts as religious, ignoring the socio-political dimensions of religion and of these conflicts. Peacemaking, I think, becomes difficult, if not impossible, when we ignore the complex and interrelated economic, political, and social realities on the ground. So my argument, to clarify, is not that all conflicts in which religions are involved are reducible to socio-political issues. That's not my argument. I think that there are genuine differences among the world's religions that are sources of tension. Just to give examples, these might include the role of religion in relation to the state, the different understandings of the nature of law, individual and community rights, the way truth claims are understood and professed. But such differences need not result in conflict among religions. I think through dialogue and mutual understanding, these differences may be understood and ways found to live together peacefully in the midst of our differences. Interfaith peacemaking does not overlook differences or should not overlook differences, but encourage openness, self-criticism, attentiveness to each other's positions, and friendships that build peaceful communities. The view that religion has nothing to do with conflict and violence reflects what I would call or describe as an uncritical and idealistic understanding of the historical role of religion. The contrasting argument that religion is intrinsically violent, divisive, and oppressive is also a sweeping generalization that ignores the profound resources in the world's religions for peacemaking, as well as the actual historical contributions of religion to peace. A recent book by Professor Lähnemann titled Interreligious and Peace Education in Times of Crisis, A History of Religions for Peace, is a good documentation of the role of at least one organization, one global organization, Religions for Peace, in the work of peacemaking. So unlike those who dismiss religion as having nothing to contribute to peacemaking, I think it is important to acknowledge that our traditions are capable of self-critical reflection, self-correction, adaptation, and change. And I think one of the unprecedented opportunities of our present context is the possibility of growth and mutual transformation through interreligious dialogue and encounters. So in spite of the fact that the historical legacy of every religion when it comes to violence is a tarnished one, these religions continue to be potent sources of visions, values, and moral energies which are capable of renewing, transforming, and healing human communities. So what are some of those resources that our traditions offer us for overcoming violence and for peace building? And what are some of the challenges and obstacles that religions face in lifting up these resources and advocating for peace? In exploring these questions, I will speak in a very special way about the tradition of Hinduism that I study and practice, but I think my observations hold relevance for other traditions as well. Among the many purposes of religion is that they serve as identity markers. Whatever their positive content in terms of theological doctrines and ritual practices, these traditions also serve to distinguish us from those with different identity markers. So when I describe myself as a Hindu, I am professing commitment to certain teachings that include, for a belief in the teaching of karma, rebirth, immortality, certain ritual observances in the temple and in the home. But I'm also distinguishing myself from practitioners of other traditions. I'm also saying what I am not. So a critical question when thinking about the role of religion in contributing to division and conflict is this: how do our traditions, as I said, as identity markers, as formers of identity, how do our traditions dispose us to think about those who do not share these religious markers or who do not share our religious identity? What is the historical vocabulary that we have inherited and in many ways still use to speak about them? Or let's try a more challenging way of articulating this question. Who is the negativized other or the devalued other in relation to whom we profess our religious identity? Our sacred texts, traditions, stories, practices often point to this despised other against whom we assert our own higher self-worth, our own higher value. Having a despised community results often in the creation of hierarchies, social hierarchies, legitimized by religious interpretations that ascribe varying values to human beings, and in doing so, also limit access to resources that they need for their well-being, for their flourishing. And in times of social, economic, and political tension, religious identities that emphasize these differences and deny shared identity contribute to mistrust and contribute to hostility. There are so many examples that one can give of this process working historically, from ancient times, I think, right on to the present times. And you may be able to think of such examples. And these, the other sometimes is not always an external other. The negativized one is not always an external negativized one. It could be an internal negativized one as well. In the case of the Hindu tradition, the negativized other is not an external one, but an internal lower caste or outcast. And in more recent times, the rise of an ideology of Hindu nationalism and the construction of a Hindu identity based on land and nation has led to the negativization of minorities on the Indian subcontinent, and especially minorities who profess a Christian identity or an Islamic one. And this creates the conditions for hate and violence. Religious chants are loudly recited in public spaces to invoke fear and to divide. So again, my argument on this point is not that a religious identity intrinsically disposes us to divisiveness and conflict. Identity formation is a natural social process that involves the awareness of difference and is a very useful marker when it functions in a descriptive way. So when I say I am Hindu, of course, I'm saying what I am not, but it's a useful descriptor for you to understand who I am. But these identities, including, of course, we're speaking about religious ones, they become problematic when the basis of the hierarchies, when they become the basis of hierarchies that privilege one identity and regard others as inferior. And when religion blesses those hierarchies, those deeply entrenched structures of inequality, whether they are based on race, ethnicity, gender, or nationality. And in this way, I am saying religion contributes to the denial. By the denial of a shared identity, religion makes it easier for hate and conflict to thrive. It is interesting, and you can think about it, interesting how historically the denial of a shared identity with others is a predictable and persistent feature of communities in conflict, past and present. And as the scholar Mark Juergensmeyer reminds us, and I'm quoting, "It is difficult," he wrote, "to belittle, to kill a person whom one knows and for whom one has no personal antipathy." So what is required of our religious traditions today so that they avoid sanctioning and reinforcing structures that divide human beings and contribute to conflict? What do we need from these traditions? And here is my suggestion. While, of course, our particular communities will always be important to us, it is imperative that our traditions speak without ambiguity for a shared human identity and a shared human community that transcends our limited particular boundaries. I believe that all of our traditions, in their different ways, have resources, theological, philosophical, to speak of this for this inclusive community, and not only on behalf of their own interests. I believe this to be a theological and moral imperative if religions are to be peacemakers. In my Hindu tradition, our sacred texts, the Vedas, speak of the sacred as, I'm quoting, that from which all beings originate, by which they are all sustained and to which they all return. So the Hindu tradition understands the sacred one to be the source of everyone and everything. No one is excluded. And I have learned from my Christian theological friends and teachers that the biblical tradition doesn't begin with a particular community or a particular nation, but begins with the creation of the cosmos. All, the universe. As in the Hindu tradition, the sacred is the origin of everyone and everything. The understanding of this one sacred reality as the source of all is important as the distinctive understandings of the nature of the sacred. And I believe that this requires renewed emphasis in our times. I'm aware of non-theistic traditions that do not employ the language of divinity to speak of the universe, the cosmos, in different ways, but in different ways, these traditions also teach about the unity and interdependent nature of all existence. The grave danger, I can't emphasize this enough because it continues to be a source of justification for unequal regard of others. The grave danger of overlooking the universality of the sacred or the divine, or by whatever name you speak of that one. The grave danger is that of understanding the sacred as a tribal, as an ethnic, as a national deity of our religious community, our ethnic group, our nation, my God. The consequence is a privileging of our own particular identities in relation to others. When the divine, if we use the God language, when God becomes our God, my God, sharing our own partialities, our own prejudices, our own narrow interests, it is not uncomplicated. It is not difficult to invoke that being, that God, on our side in times of conflict with other communities. We are historical beings, conditioned by our experiences and by the cultural lens and symbols through which we see and interpret reality. It is natural that we also interpret the sacred through the familiar prism of these symbols and the cultural worlds in which we are immersed. But we need, however, to complement these localized understandings of the divine with the insight about divine universality. Our particular and distinctive ways of speaking are precious and are not displaced by the universal, but without a vision of the universal, lacking that vision, there is the real danger of centering ourselves in a being that we create in our own image, having our own prejudices, our likes and dislikes, hating those we hate, and loving those we love. This is our God taking our side in conflicts and giving approval to our acts of violence against others. So the understanding of the divine as the universal understanding of the divine is radical, I would say, for our understanding of our relationship with each other. And it's one of the most important resources of our tradition, the idea that human beings constitute a single family with moral obligations to each other. So any tradition affirming a universal sacred being cannot close its eyes and ears to suffering and injustice anywhere. Religions that have a limited concern for the suffering that occurs only in their own communities will not be good peacemakers, will not be promoters of reconciliation between communities in tension and in conflict. So again, to give example from my own tradition, because that's, I think, where we all have to start. We all have to be self-critical. Quite recently, when I heard one of the most popular names of God in my own tradition, Ram, chanted by weapon-bearing worshippers to invoke fear in other communities, I had to remind my Hindu brothers and sisters that Ram is not a limited tribal clan deity of the Hindu community, but the infinite being who is the source of all life and all existence. I had to remind them that the theologians who wrote about Ram spoke of him as the abode of loving compassion for all, and that we express our commitment to Ram in loving and generous and inclusive relationships and in the work of building loving communities. So I had to say, hate if you must, but not in Ram's name. I mentioned earlier that religions contribute to conflict when these help to solidify exclusive identities and deny shared identities or shared identity among human beings. We see historically the extent to which communities in conflict go to deny connectedness with each other. It is a necessary condition, a prelude to exploitation and violence. To intentionally hurt others, we must cease seeing ourselves in them. Now, here in the United States, most recently, and this is an ongoing problem, I use one community. The Haitian communities in the United States became the focus of the ongoing practice of hierarchy making, marginalization, and the denial of shared identity. It was not enough for some politicians to name them as illegal. It was necessary to speak of and to create myths about them, their contribution to the spread of diseases, the increase in crime. The underlying false claim is that they are different. They are not like us. We have nothing in common with them. They do not belong to our community. They do not deserve our compassion, our care, our concern. So there is a rhetoric that dehumanizes and criminalizes those who we don't want to see as part of the larger human family. Unfortunately, such rhetoric finds support among religious groups, and especially those who champion the fusion of religious and national identities. Interpretations of religious teachings that contribute to the dehumanization of others contribute to division and conflict and not peace making. So I'm arguing about the importance of lifting up those teachings of our tradition that speak of the universality of the sacred as the source of all life. There are no strangers. There are no outsiders. That has to be the core proclamation of our tradition in these times. But there is something more that we need to say from our religious traditions if we are to be peacemakers. We need also to give prominence to the meaning and wider implications of a related teaching that is found in different expressions in our traditions, and which is a powerful antidote to the rhetoric and to dehumanizing systems. The sacred texts of my tradition, the Hindu tradition, after speaking, as I said earlier, about the emergence of the cosmos from one sacred reality, teach that this one exists equally and identically in everyone and in everything. No one is excluded. There's a fundamental unity, a oneness at the heart of reality through which we're all connected. This teaching is the source of the inherent dignity and equal worth of every human being. It is our spiritual challenge to any effort to deny the personhood, the worth, and the dignity of others. Other traditions do not employ the same language of the Hindu tradition. The Jewish and the Christian traditions, for example, speak of human beings created in the image of the divine, the imago Dei idea. But the implication is the same. The implication here is that we cannot honor the sacred and devalue other human beings, or we cannot support identities and social systems that are founded on hate and inequality. We are called to treat each other with reverence, with love. Religions contribute to conflict when they legitimize and condone systems that dehumanize other human beings. And we need humanizing traditions. I believe strongly that a fundamental requirement of religions to be better peacemakers is a rethinking of the relationship between religion and state. There are always grave dangers when religion and nation are identified. One such danger is that the entire meaning, purpose, and potential of a religion is narrowly interpreted through the lens of state political interests at any given moment in time. And I want to emphasize that any religious tradition that is centered on what I have spoken about as a universal sacred, who is the singular source of all life and in whose love all I embrace, cannot limit the sphere of care and compassion to the boundaries of a nation or a national state. The glorification of the nation is often, in actuality, the glorification of a particular ethnic or religious community above all other groups considered to have lesser worth. The spiritual problem of egocentrism, condemned in all of our traditions, do not disappear when these are projected and transferred onto the nation and when we exalt ourselves in the name of our nations. In fact, these become even more dangerous when professed in the name of the nation, since there is a self-deception that conceals the betrayal of fundamental religious virtues. Our religious traditions surrender their moral power to the state and become subservient to its narrow agenda. This is a dangerous religious malfunction. In situations of political rivalry, I give you an example, like that obtaining, for example, between India and Pakistan, and in other parts of the world, where the majority of each nation identifies with a different religion, the result is that the meaning of one's religious identity comes to include hate and hostility for those belonging to other traditions. The virus of hate rapidly spreads and distorts religious commitments. So freedom from hate requires that we see our traditions not as national or ethnic religions, but as making universal claims about what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and affirming dignity and compassion for all beings. The challenge of reclaiming our traditions from those who narrowly identified with nation and who believe that it legitimizes hate is urgent and not to be underestimated. Religions that uncritically identify with a state surrender the freedom to speak on behalf of people who are perceived as enemies of the state, within national boundaries and even beyond. 90 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi gave a stern warning about the nation state that is even more valid today and needs to be heeded by our religious communities. And I quote, "The state," he wrote in 1935, "represents violence in a concentrated and organized form. The individual has a soul, but the state is a soulless machine which can never be weaned from violence, to which it owes its very existence." He knew well that the concentration of power in the hands of the state is associated too often with a diminished moral responsibility and a reckless use of violence. He was always fearful that any increase in state power was an increase in the possibilities of violence. The seduction and rewards of subservience to state power are temptations, real temptations, that religions must learn to resist if they are to be faithful to their moral visions and to their role as peacemakers. For me, the proper role of a religious tradition in relation to the state is not the aspiration to become the master of the state or its obedient servant. The proper role is what some traditions speak of as the prophetic one. This is the commitment to be the independent moral conscience of the state. It is the courage in the famous phrase attributed to Black civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, and I quote, to speak truth to power. Nation-state leaders with increasingly narrow visions prioritize the interests of their nations and parties. The My Nation First ideology is rapidly growing. Leaders who see the world as divided into competing racial groups and want to preserve the power of their own communities speak for their own race or ethnic communities. Managers and shareholders of powerful global corporations with the sole aim of profit enhancement speak for the interests of their shareholders. On whose behalf do the religions of the world speak? On whose behalf do we speak? We certainly have obligations to speak on behalf of the interests and concerns of our particular communities, but we cannot, as too often happens, stop there. In a world dominated by narrow interests, religious voices are among the few that have a spiritual vision and have the moral resources to speak passionately and with compassion for the human community in its entirety. In a fragmented world dominated by competing narrow interests, religious voices are among the few that can do this. And to speak especially for those that are dehumanized, devalued, trapped in cycles of what appears to be inescapable suffering. A religion that does not speak for the community of beings will not be a religion that contributes to peacemaking. I do have a few more points that I would have liked to make, but I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we'll stop here. And I will pass back to my colleague, Professor Lähnemann, who I think will offer some concluding remarks, and he would moderate the rest of our discussion today. So thank you for being attentive. I wish I had more time, but I respect the generous time that I was given. Thank you very much, Professor Lähnemann.
Thank you very much for opening up the whole complex field of religions as peacemakers on the one hand, and as instigators of violence on the other, in such a differentiated way. You have shown that we need to look at the factors of fundamental beliefs, but also of nation and cultural identity, of tolerance and power, of majorities and minorities. However, you have not only analyzed, but also made visible that the new challenges facing religious communities in order for humanity and nature, that they survive. I would like to highlight just 2 points here that seem particularly important to me. One is the need for self-criticism in religious communities. The second is the importance of interfaith education and encounters. Professor Azakaram emphasized the first point in particular in the annual Lähnemann Interfaith Peacebuilding Education lecture last year. She said only if religious communities are capable of self-criticism can they convincingly contribute to a sustainable future. That is difficult, because from the outside, self-criticism is quickly interpreted as weakness. From inside, it is easily seen as smearing of the nest. But only with self-criticism is a new approach possible. If religious communities exercise self-criticism, it is a signal for their strength, not for their weakness. It empowers resilience. As an example, I would like to mention how the churches in Germany self-critically came to terms with their problematic role during the National Socialist era. More recently, I would like to point out how Orthodox theologians around the world have contradicted the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate support for the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. They have condemned the ideology of the so-called Russian world as heresy, just as the confessing church in Germany once contradicted the German nationalist Christian movement with the Barmen Theological Declaration in 1934. The second area concerns the key role of education and encounters. Knowledge of each other and personal encounters between people of different religions and cultures are the best prevention of hatred and violence, and the basis for good cooperation and mutual enrichment. This is a central task for education in the religious communities themselves, but also in cooperation with public education in schools, youth work, and adult education. Young people will only be equipped for living together in a way that will ensure the continued existence of our planet if they respect their fellow human beings, feel responsibility for all the living as well as the inanimate work. I would like just to highlight 2 practical examples. One practical example is in Germany, are the groups of the so-called Abraham teams, where a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian visit schools and talk about their beliefs to the pupils, to the students. Another example would I like to highlight what Professor Ziad Gross, who is with us, is working in Israel, where she brings together Palestinians and Israelis for exchange, and at the moment has a fascinating project of consolation for people who are hurt by the war and who are touched by it. And it's interesting that what just Professor Rambachan said, that in the sources, in the Holy Scriptures, we have narratives which can help us to receive resilience, to come over the hurts which have been. These just as two examples which really are there, and there are many, many which we have to bring into our educational endeavors. So thank you very much, Professor Rambachan. It was wonderful. Again, thank you, Henrik. Our time is at the end, and I would like to thank you all to be with us in these very, very wonderful reflections or necessary reflections which we have. And of course, we could go on exchanging views. Also, the whole question of cultural exchange, which helps us to know each other better in music and other possibilities. And I would like to thank Thea Gomlauri very much for organizing everything for this night. And it was wonderful to have you from so many countries and contexts with us. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I see many of my friends there. I can't greet each of you individually, but I'm so grateful. From Minnesota, some of you joined us, and from other parts of the world. So my respect to each one of you. And thank you, Professor Lähnemann, and thank you, Thea, for bringing us together in this convening. Let us say, to be continued.
Yes. Blessings to you all.
Thank you.